the cause of the climate crisis, right? Which countries are most responsible for those emissions? Because, of course, no one wants to be blamed. Right now, the world needs all sorts of skills to solve what is only going to be a growing challenge for us. Africa is grossly underrepresented at the G20, but, small islands don't even have a seat.
I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. My guest today is a powerhouse in the world of climate resilience. I'm honored to welcome Pepukaye Bardouille, whose career has spanned continents. Pepukaye has served in both the public and private sectors, from the Prime Minister's office in Barbados to her impactful tenure at the International Financial Corporation. She's also a founding member of the Climate Resilience Executing Agency for Dominica, CREED, created to drive the bold national vision of making Dominica the world's first climate resilient country following the devastation of Hurricane Marina. She's also the co-author of 20 papers on energy access and sustainability and co-curator of a compelling book spotlighting the stories of everyday women navigating adversity with what she calls fierce grace. We chat about the climate change challenges faced by small island developing states and the lessons she's learned from her trailblazing career. So thank you for joining us, Pep. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak to you. Could you share the journey that led you to specialize in climate resilience and sustainable development? Were there pivotal moments or influences that directed your career towards this field?
Hi, Soraya. It's great to be here. It's interesting. Whenever I get asked about my journey or my career, I say that most of it is accidental. But the reality is that from a very young age, I've cared quite deeply about people and about the planet. And for me, all of that is encompassed in sustainable development. So my first job as a program officer with the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, in New York was many, many moons ago. I thought up until then that the area I was most passionate about was water. And I just so happened to land in the office of I like to sometimes call him a nutty professor, who was a reformed nuclear physicist, who, turned his attention to renewables quite soon after the Rio conference in 1992, and then kind of started to push this renewables agenda very strongly. And I was very young. I was just out of my master's degree and was given a pretty significant role in editing a book called Energy After Rio, which was, 5 years after the Rio conference. And I think having the trust or faith of this professor, this director of the unit, to actually just kind of get into the meat of things and provide my perspective on that book, in literally sitting there writing, bits and pieces of it, but really editing the book was quite a pivotal moment. And I think that is really what anchored my commitment to sustainability, albeit from an energy perspective. And I'm sure you'll have more detailed questions on, the journey between, here and there. But another extremely significant moment was after the passage of Hurricane Marina in 2017. The island nation that I'm from, Dominica, was devastated by that Category 5 storm. And just by chance, I was working in South Africa at the time. But just by chance, a friend and colleague sent me an email and said, "Hey, Pep, they are setting up a resilience agency, a climate resilience agency in Dominica. I think you'd be a great fit. You should apply." And so I did, just by chance, put in an application. And that was my first formal role in a leadership position in the space of climate resilience.
Thank you. And really, coming from Dominica, how has that influenced the way you approach climate resilience? Do you feel it gives you a unique perspective?
In part, yes. I mean, Dominica is a small island developing state. SIDS, as they're known, have a very particular set of challenges. They're not just, susceptible or vulnerable to the climate crisis. But there are a bunch of other challenges: small populations, distance from large markets, high cost of human resources, high cost of goods. So there's a lot of issues related to resilience in general, and then of course there's climate resilience. But I actually grew up in Zambia in Southern Africa, and the bulk of my career, of my professional life, has focused on Eastern and Southern Africa. I've done a lot of work in the Middle East. I've done some work in South Asia. And so I would say that, yes, I think what cemented my passion for the resilience agenda is very much the plight of SIDS. But what has influenced the recommendations and the policy slant that I take is really a global South perspective more broadly.
And what are the differences? A lot of times when we're talking about small island development states and we're talking about Africa, people seem to put two together, and they're very different issues. What are those differences, and how have they influenced you?
There are similarities and differences. I would say the similarities are that many small island developing states are water stressed. They face, climate catastrophes in the form of, hurricanes. If you look at the African continent, if you look at, some of the destruction that Mozambique or Malawi have experienced in the past couple of years, those were from tropical cyclones. So, is it a hurricane or is it a cyclone? Is it hitting an island with a coast, or is it hitting a country like Mozambique, which has, thousands of kilometers of coastline, right? So those are some of the similarities. I think the main differences are that for many small island developing states, certainly not all, Madagascar, some of the other islands, the Comoros, Cabo Verde, off the coast of Africa, these are certainly islands that have lower incomes, but many, for example, Dominica or Barbados, which is the island nation for which I work at the moment, I work with the government, are considered middle to high income countries, right? So there are certainly some significant, differences. Because the large majority of the African continent is low income countries. There are definitely countries that are growing out of that low income status into the middle income. There's a huge amount of economic development on the continent. Countries like Nigeria have fast growing economies, but there is a difference in terms of economic fortune at the moment. In addition, I think it's just the population, right? You've got fast growing and in some cases very high populations on the African continent. In our small island states, I mean, small, right? Small by size of land mass, but also typically small by population. In many instances, a declining population because there's quite a big, exodus or emigration from our countries to the global north or to other nations in proximity. So you have these differences. And then I would say lastly, in terms of natural resources, again, looking at the African continent, many countries have this natural wealth in the form of minerals, in the form of forest cover, in the form of water resources. Island nations, again, particularly in the Caribbean, are very short on those natural resources. In fact, the bulk of our resources are potentially in the ocean, in the blue economy, but they haven't been explored. And a tremendous amount of our resources are in our people, our young people who are highly educated. But again, we're losing many of those people because of lack of opportunity.
Your point about what we sometimes call the brain drain in some of these islands, does that affect the way we can respond to climate resilience? Is there a lack of knowledge or expertise in the region, or is that not a thing?
No, absolutely. I think, just to start with, because the population is small, you just have fewer people who are experts in anything because there are just fewer people in the country, right? So just a law of large numbers. And in countries where you have large numbers of people, you just have a larger pool. So certainly that. I would say the quality of education in the Caribbean, if you look at the University of the West Indies, for example, is very high. So you've got tremendous expertise, tremendous knowledge, but we lose that knowledge, be that in the form of, nurses and doctors, or or scientists or policymakers or people in finance. And the reality is that in the climate crisis, we need people who are experts in, health policy and in public health. We need experts in climate science. We need experts in finance. And so taken as a whole, absolutely, there's a tremendous impact of losing our tertiary, graduates from tertiary education, and in losing folks who have spent many, many years developing knowledge domestically, but actually choose at some point in time to take their careers elsewhere. There simply isn't the rate of replacement of that knowledge domestically, again, because of the small populations.
Thank you. As the director of the Bridgetown Initiative, what are the primary objectives you're aiming to achieve? How does this initiative address the unique challenges faced by small island developing states in the context of climate change?
The Bridgetown Initiative has three key pillars or themes in its third iteration. We're currently in Bridgetown 3.0, as we fondly call it, which is really, 3.5 or so years into the initiative. It's a slight refinement of the objectives, but the three key areas are firstly changing the rules of the game. The international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, were established, 80 years ago. The world looked very different at that time. Firstly, from the point of view of which countries were independent, and therefore, which countries got what position or seat at the table. But secondly, in terms again of which populations, which countries had the highest populations and the fastest growing populations, and where we see the highest economic growth and development. The global South is, I would say, arguably, the place to be when it comes to innovation and growth. It's certainly not the only place, but it is showing its wealth and its strength. And that's not reflected in the governance structure of the IFIs. And therefore, voice and representation of the global South, and in particular of those countries which are most vulnerable to crises, including the climate crisis, needs to look quite different in today's environment. Secondly, we speak about shock-proofing economies. Be it from climate-related catastrophes or disasters such as the COVID pandemic, which wreaked havoc on countries, on economies. For example, small island developing states in the Caribbean, the case of Barbados, 45 to 55% of the economy is directly or indirectly dependent on tourism revenue, with essentially the tourism dollar stopping during COVID at its worst. How our economy is supposed to survive. So we have this point around shock-proofing economies, but there's a huge portion which relates to climate. Last July, Hurricane Beryl barreled through the Caribbean. It hit 4 islands worst. It hit Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada, and St. Vincent. And each of those countries, was affected in a different way. Barbados, it was around coastal flooding and storm surge and the destruction of shipping and, fishing vessels around the island. In Grenada, the island of Carriacou, the whole island's infrastructure was essentially flattened in a 24-hour period. By that storm. So, the impact was different, but the result was still a huge burden on the national government to figure out how it was going to recover. There are instruments that exist. For example, the World Bank has catastrophe drawdown options, or CAT-DDO for short, which provides emergency liquidity after catastrophe. In this case, climate catastrophe. However, that instrument wasn't available or wasn't in place for all of those islands. In fact, only Grenada benefited. And so when we think about shock-proofing economies, the question arises, firstly, do we have the instruments that can help us do that? Do we have insurance instruments? Do we have, debt pause clauses, which is one of the instruments that the Bridgetown Initiative is a huge, huge proponent of? Do we have sufficient investment in climate adaptation that allows countries to avoid losses, or in disaster preparedness, which protects people and infrastructure in the event of a disaster, right? So all of these things need to be in place. Do they exist? Is the first question. And the second question is, are they affordable and available at the time of need? And so that's a second area, which is around shock proofing. And the last is simply that we need to scale up resources. We need those resources to be much larger when it comes to climate change mitigation. We need much more investment in low carbon technologies. And are all countries able to access those resources at an affordable rate? Or are some countries penalized when it comes to, how their risk perception affects the cost of capital? And in other cases, on the adaptation side, do we have access to that cheaper, longer term financing? I'm talking about concessional resources available at a 30 to 50-year payback period, which is the only type of money that most developing countries, including small island developing states, even if they're middle to high income, because of the sheer magnitude of investment that needs to be made. That's the only money that's really affordable. And is that money available at the rates and at the quantum necessary to essentially invest in the adaptation in line with our plans for resilience?
There has been a lot of discussion every time there's a COP of what is the responsibility for larger countries, larger polluting countries towards small island development states, etc. Is that a discussion that continues? And is there a role when there are climate disasters for those countries to take?
Yeah, the question of responsibility is a big one. If we look historically at where has the largest portion of emissions, it's affected the increase in global warming, or essentially the cause of the climate crisis, right? Which countries are most responsible for those emissions? I think it's a very contentious point because, of course, no one wants to be blamed for challenges. And actually, when it comes to the question of losses and damages, it's not just an issue of are you at fault, but the question arises, are you going to pay for the impact, right? Which is where loss and damage comes in. So the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage was established, about a year ago, and has been, capitalized with about $700 million, which is a sizable amount of money, but it's nowhere close to the amount of money that's needed. If you look at the loss and damage that was suffered in Dominica from Hurricane Maria, it amounted to in excess of $1.2 billion. That's for an island of 65, 70,000 people. Destruction from one storm, that's the impact of a 24-hour over a 24-hour period of this Category 5 hurricane. That's $1.2 billion. Loss and damage fund is capitalized at $700 million. So you can already run the numbers. If we look at the impact of the flooding that was suffered in Pakistan a few years ago, 30 million people were affected, either displaced or lost their livelihoods. How do you pull together the resources needed to compensate people and businesses and governments from the loss, not just of lives, but of infrastructure, of entire agricultural sectors, of crops? It's unclear how we're going to get the damages and losses to be covered by the resources made available.
When we're talking about Hurricane Maria, are there any lessons learned that we can take from Hurricane Maria? One of the things I think is very interesting, Dominica's terrain is different levels. When we're talking about Bahamas, Barbados, we're talking about low-lying Caribbean islands. Where damage and protection is a little bit more difficult. So I'm wondering, what are the lessons learned from Hurricane Maria, and what can we do? What can low-lying Caribbean islands do to protect themselves?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Dominica has a very, undulating topography, right? There's a lot of hills. There's a lot of mountains. In fact, it's an extremely mountainous island. It's a volcanic island. But yes, Antigua, Bahamas, Barbados, other islands, atolls in the Pacific are flatter. I don't know how much one can actually learn in terms of topography, because I've spoken with, colleagues in the island of Nauru who've essentially said, look, we need to move all our infrastructure from the coast to higher land. The reality is that even if you look at Dominica, most infrastructure is built along the coast. Mm-hmm. There's very little that is central precisely because of that topography. And this is typical, right? Typically years, centuries ago, infrastructure was built, in ways that would allow you to connect from one place to the other. And connecting across those mountainous areas is very, very difficult. So those are more isolated communities. So I would argue that in many cases, the challenges that a Dominica faces are very similar to a Barbados in terms of coastal erosion. If you look at the capital city, Roseau, it's right there, right by the sea. And so certainly a challenge. I do think, though, that the lessons are less topographical or topographical, however we pronounce it. I think most of the lessons are really around, how do you build infrastructure that is resilient? So how do you begin to underground power lines? How do you address, issues of water availability? So climate vulnerability is not just about storms and floods. It is also about droughts and very unreliable and unpredictable rainfall patterns. If you look at a place like Barbados, there's tremendous rain at the moment, but actually the ground, because it's a coral island, the ground doesn't replenish. Groundwater is not being replenished. The aquifers are not benefiting from that rain. And so, what can you learn from countries that are more endowed when it comes to surface water, rivers like Dominica? I think you can learn something about flood management. How do those countries deal with high levels of rain because, there's a lot of overflow from the rivers? Can flood management be flood management expertise be transferred? But I think the main lessons are around, at least from Dominica, relate to what we built with the Climate Resilience Execution Agency. And that, related to managing large projects and capital works programs that were designed to make sure that the impact suffered during Maria was not repeated again. So, building housing stock. And this is not done by Credo, it's done by the government, building a housing stock that's truly climate resilient. For me, the most important piece of this climate resilient story is around your populations that are the most vulnerable. Those are not necessarily only the people who live by the coast. They're really the people who live in difficult conditions because they're below the poverty line, or because they are, elderly people who have no one to rely on, or, one parent households with several children who have no one to look after them if they're not home. So I think these are the lessons: is how do you build a welfare system? And I'm not saying that Dominica has sorted this out. I'm saying that these are the lessons around the priorities for every country. It is, how do you build a welfare system that addresses the needs of the most vulnerable people when there isn't a disaster, so that when there is a disaster, they do not suffer the worst possible fate.
Thank you. Many members of the diaspora want to contribute to their home countries but aren't sure how. What role do you think the Caribbean diasporas can play supporting climate resilience and sustainable development in their home countries?
My biggest ask of the diaspora is to think about what skill sets they have and how those skills can be transferred or can be lent to their home countries. Not everyone's able to go back. People have lives. They have, property. They have jobs. They have families, in the countries that are now their home, right? This is effectively like a dual citizenship, right? You're part of the diaspora, but you live where you live, be it the UK or Canada, the US, or, Argentina or Germany. But often, to go back to the question around brain drain, often, the people who we have lost have gone with their skills, be they scientists or public health officials or policymakers. They may have improved their skills. They may be working for a Fortune 500 company that is just incredibly good at executing large projects. They may be working for a bank that's just really good at financial innovation. They may be working in the insurance industry that knows how to manage risk. They may be working in science. They may have, been excellent innovators in new products or new materials. To take those skills back, even if it's for 2 years. I went back to Dominica for 2 years to run Creed. I brought skills with me, and I learned probably 5 times more than I knew before I came. But I wasn't afraid to go home and to see what I could do on the ground. For those who are not able to, of course, there is the opportunity to contribute financially. The reality is that many, many people in the diaspora are already sending home in the form of remittances, resources to their families. They're helping to build schools. They're doing a huge amount. But I think that much more needs to happen in a structured way so that skills do not only leave, but come back like a boomerang, in a good way, come back to their countries of origin, in a way that's tangible. The biggest issue that we see in most governments, in small countries, again, it's that limited number of people who are just really good at stuff. And so bringing back those resources and complementing in a way, to the extent that it's possible, complementing the existing government staff base with your skill sets is, I think, a huge potential contribution.
What challenges have you faced as a Caribbean woman, and how have you overcome them in your field?
I don't know that the challenges I've faced professionally are to do with me being a Caribbean woman. I think they're just the challenges of working in a sector, in a space, in a field, which is, sometimes seen as new, sometimes seen as irrelevant, sometimes seen as fringe. If we look at some of the challenges that colleagues that are active in the climate and development space are facing today, that's not because they're, a Caribbean woman. That's because, geopolitically, there are lots of shifts happening. There are lots of changes. And I think that those changes, are going to be very painful in some instances, and in others, they're going to force us to think differently. Is there merit in questioning the effectiveness and efficiency of international aid? Absolutely. Does that put us, on the hot spot to figure out new ways of doing things that are more cost effective, that deliver better impact? Yes. And so for me, these are, some of the questions that I've grappled with my entire career, and not because I'm a Caribbean woman. I think that others may, and in some instances, I certainly have witnessed, being questioned because you're from a small island, right? Not necessarily from the Caribbean. What do you know about development in Africa? And if we go back to what we talked about earlier, there's many similarities and there are many differences. And I think we're not always recognized for knowing things about other places. Just because we're from one country doesn't mean we don't understand others. And I think, as far as I said, my experience has not always been positive, but in the main, I think it has. I think a last thought is that that point around having a seat at the table. Often in this development and climate space, people want to defer to colleagues from larger countries. So what's the perspective of a Brazil? What's the perspective of a China? What's the perspective of an India? What about a South Africa? Because those countries are just larger. And so, often, while you may be asked for a perspective, you don't necessarily have a seat at the table. So let's look at the G20, for example. We don't have a seat at the G20. Africa is grossly underrepresented at the G20, but, small islands don't even have a seat. So I would say, again, that's less a personal issue, and that's more a question of where we fit in the geopolitical power hierarchy.
In your recent commentary, you highlighted the need for comprehensive financial reforms to support climate vulnerable countries. What specific reforms do you believe are most urgent to bridge the climate finance gap?
So if we go back to my point around the Bridgetown Initiative and areas that need to be addressed, if I put aside the sort of voice and representation point, and really focus on the last one, which is a need for more cheaper, longer term financing, the question is, where is that going to come from? At a time when overseas development assistance is being reformed and not in the right direction, when we're seeing less resources made available for those countries that are poorest, when the sustainable development goals are in question. And so, we don't know how resource allocation for water, for, education, for health are actually going to be allocated. I think it's a real steep uphill climb for climate as well, right? So we're all kind of in the same boat. I think the biggest issue for me is not recognizing that building resilience in general and building resilience to the climate crisis is an investment imperative as well as an investment opportunity. When we look at the renewable energy space, technologies are proven. Costs of solar PV and of onshore wind have come down exponentially, right? It's the opposite of exponentially in the other direction over the past decade. So these are more than commercially viable technologies. And there are many investors that are looking for transactions that they can undertake at scale around the world. So seeing resilience as just a cost center, where are we going to get free money? Where are we going to get cheap money? I think is misleading. A huge amount of investment opportunity exists. And where does that investment opportunity look biggest? In most cases, in emerging markets and developing economies. And so I would say that the biggest, mindset shift for me around climate finance is seeing it as a commercial opportunity, in many cases commercially viable without subsidies in large numbers of countries. And the other portion, which is around investment and adaptation, where again, we need that concessional financing. In many cases, we need grant financing. It's trying to figure out how the system can deliver more by implementing the capital adequacy framework, for example.
So in your recent commentary, you highlighted the need for comprehensive financial reforms to support climate vulnerable countries. What specific reforms do you believe are most urgent to bridge the climate finance gap?
The reforms that are needed, I think, are sort of twofold. One is to catalyze private investment, and the other is to catalyze public investment, right? So that they fit into those two categories. On the private investment side, I think we need to find ways for the diminishing volume of overseas development assistance, bilateral support, and concessional financing that's available, for example, through the World Bank and through the regional development banks, through the IDA, International Development Association, or equivalent funding window for low-income countries, as well as the funding available through IBRD or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development to middle-income countries. We need to find a way for that money to go much further and to leverage private capital. When we look at climate change mitigation, renewable energy, and the opportunities, the investment opportunities that are commercially viable to scale these resources, these technologies in emerging markets and developing countries, they're tremendous. But we need to unlock that investment. And in some instances, that requires, concessional capital to come to the table first. In other instances, it requires proof of concept, but the technologies are there. And I think that on the commercial side, so much more can be achieved by leveraging development banks and in some instances, blended finance or de-risking instruments. On the public side, we need grant capital. In some cases. In other cases, again, we need concessional capital to be put to work. The reality is that many governments, if we take the case of Barbados, need access to more cheaper, longer-term financing to meet their adaptation imperatives. The reforms necessary in the international banking institutions really relates in most part to the capital adequacy framework. Is enough risk being taken when it comes to the equity to loan ratio of the IFIs? Are these institutions acting efficiently and effectively with the resources that they have at their disposal? So, there are very specific recommendations that, we don't necessarily need to go into now within the capital adequacy framework. But if those were implemented, tens of billions of dollars of capital could be unlocked. If we look at the Asian Development Bank, for example, they've unlocked an additional sizable amount of investment in the tens of billions of dollars. The World Bank just announced in October last year, on the occasion of their annual meetings, that by going from an equity to loan ratio of 19% to 18%, an additional $30 billion would be unlocked, right? So the instruments and the mechanisms are known, and now it's more about implementing them.
Thank you. Looking ahead, what innovations or policy changes do you believe are crucial for enhancing global climate resilience, especially for vulnerable nations?
The policy changes that are needed, I would say, in the most vulnerable countries relate to where we build, how we build, and why we're building things. So, it's really tempting to continue to build in places that are easy to access, for example, along the coast. But with sea level rise and with storm surge, clearly, that's the riskiest portion of any country to place a long-term infrastructure investment in. So how do we make sure that our physical development plans and the policies around, how we expand our infrastructure, our housing stock, whether we're building to category 3 or category 4 or category 5 resilience standards, whether new construction of homes or hotels or schools are, essentially reflecting the need to use water efficient technologies, be that, low flow showers or toilets, to include a water tank that's going to capture or catch rainwater. So there's many things that can be done that are on the policy side that, yes, will have a cost implication, but if they're designed from the get go, the impact would be much, higher in terms of, reduced risk on the back end, but also the costs would be much lower because they're built into the original design as opposed to subject to retrofit later on. So those are some very practical examples of things that should
And
be
are
done.
these policies something that we would see country by country, or is there a role for regional policies?
In all cases, it is the country's responsibility. In some cases, a municipality or a sub-region's responsibility, depending on the governance structure of the country we're talking about, to adopt and implement policy guidelines. However, for example, in the case of the Caribbean, there are many policy guidelines that can be set at the regional level. So, for example, in the Eastern Caribbean, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States has policy guidance around, construction of buildings that mean that small countries, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, do not have to come up with this guidance themselves. They can subscribe to recommendations, to guidelines that have been provided at the regional level. I think the harder part is adopting these into legislation and then implementing them and making sure, that there is an entity on the ground that checks that all those housing codes, building codes, structural codes are actually being, adhered to when it comes to construction. I'll give you an example. If we look at Turkey, about a year and a bit ago, there was this devastating earthquake in Turkey, which resulted in 30 plus thousand people losing their lives because of buildings that collapsed. It turns out that many of those buildings, because Turkey is on a tectonic plate, on a fault line, and this is not the first time the country has been devastated by such tremors. In many cases, the buildings in Turkey, were simply not built to the standards that the country itself has adopted in legislation. I understand that many of those structures follow the same level, at least on paper, of earthquake resistance as structures in California. Were they built to those standards? Was there any follow-up? Was there an implementation agency or verification agency double checking that contractors were following those codes? So, at the end of the day, it comes down to the lowest level, which is town and country planning in any country, be it at the national level or at the subnational level. Do they have the guidelines? You could tick that box. Are they following those guidelines, right? Are contractors following those guidelines? And is there any penalty for them not doing so? If that's not in place, it doesn't matter what you have on paper. There's still going to be disaster.
Following standards. And this is my daily bread as a social specialist at the in my job. So yes, following the daily. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was not in place. There were no guidelines. There was nobody supervising, looking at impact assessments and things like that? Or
Sorry, where is this?
I'm just saying in Turkey.
No, I mean, I'm sure there are many people that followed guidelines. I'm sure there are many companies that built their structures to code, and probably those structures survived. I'm saying that it has also, there's also, quite a bit of documentation that codes were not followed. Building codes were not followed. And those are the buildings that collapsed. So I don't want to speak generally about Turkey. I certainly don't, I'm not an expert in Turkey, but I think it's very important to be quite nuanced when we talk about these things, that the answer is not, is there a policy? For me, the answer is there a policy? Was it adopted into legislation? Is it being implemented? And is that implementation being verified?
Yeah, and are there resources for that implementation?
And are there resources for that verification? Right? If you are a contractor and you are, authorized as a building contractor, right? You have a permit, you have a license. The question is, are you building something to code? And sometimes people are building houses themselves. We know that in lower income countries and in many countries in the Caribbean, not even low income, you get a little bit of additional money. You get a bonus at work, or your family sends some money, or you get a new job and you have a bit more money. So you add on to the back of your house, you add on a room or two. Did you use a contractor? Not necessarily. Maybe it's you and your friends from the neighborhood. Maybe it's you and your family. Maybe you're an engineer or a mechanic or someone who's skilled in carpentry and you build something. Does that mean that it's built to code? Not necessarily, right? Is someone verifying? Did you get a permit before? Did they verify afterwards? I mean, there's a reason that codes exist, and there's a reason that there's, departments in governments that check that you did what you said you were supposed to, or you did what you were supposed to do.
Do you have any personal heroes in this field or any organizations that you admire?
I don't have heroes, but there are many people that I think are deeply inspirational. So perhaps you call that heroes. I mean, I happen to work for someone who is extremely inspirational. That's the Honorable Mia Amor-Motley, Prime Minister of Barbados, who I think has excited people young and old from around the world as to what leadership looks like. I think Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who is from Chad, who is a huge proponent of indigenous rights and what we can learn from indigenous people, is tremendously inspirational. I haven't had the privilege of meeting her, but, she's someone I feel has really changed the discourse, the discussion around indigenous knowledge. And I think there are many indigenous people from around the world, certainly from my home country in Dominica, and certainly, from South America in particular. Indigenous knowledge is something that I feel is incredibly important and does not see the light of day in the way that perhaps more conventional knowledge does. So I would say, that's typically what I gravitate to for inspiration. Certainly my Prime Minister, in terms of who I work for, but also many other leaders who champion the cause from perhaps a quieter place.
What guidance would you offer to individuals aspiring to work in the field of climate resilience and sustainable development?
I think a lot depends on their skill set, where they're coming from. Are they coming from the north or the south? Are they coming from large countries or small? Do they care about the arts, the humanities? Are they engineers? As to where they go, right? I think a lot of that will dictate. But I think my first point of guidance would be, in general, to anyone seeking career advice, is to do what you care about. I have been lucky enough to have roles present themselves to me, or to have been selected for roles that I feel are just incredibly interesting and could make a difference. And I think that is a guiding light, which is, what do I care about, and can I have impact in this role? Would be my advice. It's difficult to have anything more general than that. I would say that right now the world needs all sorts of skills to solve what is only going to be a growing challenge for us, not just in the next few years, but as time passes, I feel that if we don't address what we can address, it will only get much, much, much worse. And so the key is to not lose faith or hope, but to act with optimism that you can make a difference, and to find a space where your skills, your passion, your energy, and your time are put to good use.
And we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, Pep.
Soraya, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Join us every first Tuesday of the month. Don't forget to like us, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and find us on Instagram and on our website if you'd like to be featured as a guest or have any recommendations for guests. We look forward to hearing from you.